In today's session, we're going to look at the chainsaw versus the Pampss Grass, and this poem is probably one of the easier poems in the sense that it's very easy to follow the narrative and it's very easy to determine significance behind some of the references and some of the more figurative references also. Frequently, most people are familiar with Simon Armitage as well. He's probably one of the most well-known poets in this anthology. So again, you come with that kind of familiarity attachment to it. And it's very easy to follow the language. It's easy if you know Armitage's style to read his references and to read the way he uses figurative references to imply significance. It's accessible, but equally that doesn't mean that you can't stretch this poem to the higher levels. There's lots of points where you could look in more or greater depth at the significance behind some of the social commentary, maybe about the presentation of the two different elements of the chainsaw and the Pampas Grass. Structurally, in terms of features of form, we've got 8 stanzas, but no real regularity in the rhythm or the meter. And again, you can look at the significance behind that in the sense that it allows the narrative to flow. What we do get is the kind of separated sections. Initially, we get this kind of juxtaposition of the description of the chainsaw and the juxtaposition of the description of the Pampas Grass, deliberately to kind of connote a complete contrast between these two elements. But one of the debates that you can have about this is whether or not it's dramatic monologue or whether it's a narrative poem, because within the monologue we've got the narrative, and it's not really until the end that we get a sense of the narrator's thoughts and feelings. So there's actually features of both narrative poem and dramatic monologue. I could forgive an argument for either of these two ways of interpreting the form of this text. I don't think that the monologue really comes into its own until the end of the poem, and there is a stronger sense of narrative at the start. But again, even just the clarity of distinction between those two is relatively insignificant as we start to look at how really the purpose of this poem is really about the dynamics between the two objects, and the ways in which they're representative of some much, much bigger ideas. And really the significance of the person doesn't really come in until a little bit later on, in which they're kind of rendered passive to these kind of two much bigger entities that have formed the earlier part of the narrative of the poem. So as long as you can kind of talk through that structure, it's not necessary to determine which of those two particular features it specifically is. But we're told that initially it seemed an unlikely match, and this is where we get this kind of almost colloquial reference, and the way in which the narrator deals with this narrative is almost as it's kind of telling this childish story to a kind of friendly audience, and we get this, almost kind of lovable tone, as if it's being spoken about like they're two children almost, they're two dependents, and the unlikely match characterizes it as a kind of connection, and this is what really starts to make the distinction between which of these two objects are kind of gendered in a very specific way, and gender becomes a really important distinction in this poem, particularly when you're classifying the two features. So to kind of open with that really kind of colloquial statement and maybe start to make that connection as if it's matching them, as in the sort of a pairing in some way. The fact that it's all winter unplugged, and we get this sense of maybe like hibernation and the kind of animalistic idea that you might sort of interpret there. The grinding its teeth in a plastic sleeve as if it's kind of pent up almost. And a lot of the way through this poem, we're going to get some imagery of kind of toxic masculinity, and you can certainly explore that as a theme, as if this kind of almost, the kind of kinetic energy of this chainsaw is kind of the representations of like stifled masculinity and the dangers that can come out if it's stifled for too long and left to its own devices at the end. The chainsaw